All right, good afternoon. Thank you everybody for joining us despite the rain and the cold. I'm Jack Slah. I'm the president of Historians in Law School. It's a student organization here at school. And we're excited together with the school and with the help of our dean, Kathy Cox, to be sponsoring this event. And I'm excited to see such a good turnout, including my fellow students and alumni. Welcome back and welcome home, and current attorneys here in town. So I'll turn it over to Dean Kathy Cox to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Jack, and good afternoon to all of you. I want to say a special word of welcome to Judge Hugh Lawson. We are always glad to have you here, Judge, and to my friend and fellow public servant, former State Representative Larry Walker from Perry, who served in the Georgia legislature with Governor Barnes and me. We're glad that both of you could be here, along with so many other friends and alumni and students today. It's a real pleasure to introduce you to former Governor Roy Barnes. Governor Barnes is a lifelong resident of Cobb County, Georgia. He is a double dog, having earned his history degree and his law degree from the University of Georgia and the Georgia Law School. He first went to work as a prosecutor in the Cobb County District Attorney's Office after graduating from law school, before opening his own law firm in Marietta, where he continues to practice today. The political bug bit him really early. He was elected to the Georgia Senate at age 26, becoming the youngest member of the state Senate at the time. He served 8 terms in the Georgia State Senate, rising into numerous leadership positions, and also being appointed as chairman of the Select Commission on Constitutional Revision, which rewrote the Georgia Constitution in 1983. So if any of you students want to know any interpretation about the Georgia Constitution, he's your guy.
At least my view.
He and Larry Walker both wrote the Georgia Constitution that exists today. He made his first bid for the governorship in 1990 and was unsuccessful in a primary against Zell Miller, who went on to win. But Roy Barnes came back 2 years later and was elected to the Georgia House of Representatives, where I got the chance to serve with him in the House and as a member of the House Judiciary Committee, along with State Representative Walker. In 1998, Governor Barnes was elected as the 80th governor of Georgia. He made education reform and improvements to education, public education in Georgia, a hallmark of his administration, with efforts to reduce class sizes all over the state, raise accountability standards, require more discipline in classrooms, and other reforms. He also concentrated on health care reform and remedies for urban growth and sprawl. He took on the very controversial issue of removing the Confederate battle flag from the Georgia state flag, and he won that battle, changing the Georgia flag. But many believe that battle played a big role in his defeat for re-election in 2002. Nevertheless, he was awarded in 2003 the John F. Kennedy Profiles in Courage Award for his leadership in that effort. Upon his defeat in 2002, Governor Barnes did something that really surprised the legal community. He did not go back to Marietta to start making money. He instead went to work for the Atlanta Legal Aid Office as a full-time volunteer for the next 6 months, committing his efforts and providing one of the strongest signals possible about what lawyers really owe their profession and the community. He did eventually return to private practice of law, where he has continued to work as one of the most successful trial lawyers in Georgia and the Southeast. He's known for successfully handling personal injury, wrongful death, and medical malpractice cases, along with mass tort cases and complex business disputes. There's a pretty well-known saying in Georgia that if you're in trouble, you want Roy Barnes on your side, and you don't want to have to fight against him. Governor Barnes, in my opinion, is one of the wisest and most astute political leaders Georgia has ever known, along with being one of the smartest trial lawyers ever to see a Georgia courtroom. It has been my honor to serve with him in Georgia government and a special privilege to have him here as our guest today to talk about one of his most recent endeavors in the historic Leo Frank case. Please join me in welcoming former Governor Roy Barnes.
Kathy read that just like I wrote it. So I've got to tell you just one little side note. We've had a lot of controversy, as the judges know, about Georgia's voting machines. And I had this lady that came out to interview me. She says, "Do you know they stole the election from you in 2002 with those voting machines?" I said, "No, ma'am, I think I lost that all on my own." So Van Perlberg, who's here, used to be assistant district attorney and is now in the Attorney General's office. Van and I are longtime friends. He's probably a better expert on Leo Frank than I am, so we're glad to have him. Now, you're one of the Fagan descendants.
I'm Mary Fagan Keene, the great niece.
The great niece. This is Mary Fagan Keene, who's the great niece of Mary Fagan. I want to turn you back for over 100 years of Georgia. Really back to the time of 1913. Georgia was a lot different. It had just come out about 25 or 30 years before, out of the Civil War, and a good part of the state was still recovering. In fact, if you look at the Tax Digest in 1860, it was 1960 until the Tax Digest recovered at the same amount that it was in 1860. Georgia was also torn. It was torn between the Henry Grady New South and the Old South that had been brought down in the Civil War. Grady and governors were trying to attract to Georgia any industry they could, because most of the people were desperately poor. Now, into all of that comes Leo Frank. Leo Frank was born in Texas, but he grew up in Brooklyn, and he went to Cornell, where he studied mechanical engineering. He married Lucille Seelig. The Seelig family is still one of the greatest and most well-known families in Atlanta. Seelig Properties, Steve Seelig, Slick Seelig as his father was known. Well, the Frank's uncle owned a majority of what was the National Pencil Factory, which was on Whitehall, but now it's called Peachtree, and they've divided it up. He was a member of the Temple, which is now on Peachtree, and they were mostly Reform. The Temple was Reform Jewish faith, and it was led by a fellow that was considered a radical in many aspects, and that is Rabbi David Marks. They were mostly German Jews that were members of that community, and they were assimilationist and not isolationist. The Orthodox and some conservative, but mostly Orthodox, believe in living in communities separated from other Jewish or Gentile communities. But the Reform, and particularly at this time with the German influence, were assimilationists. Those of you that have seen Driving Miss Daisy, Miss Daisy was, her son was a member of the Temple. The Temple was bombed, by the way, in the 1950s because they were very pro-civil rights. And another lawyer at the time, Eddie Garland's father, Reuben Garland, defended the fellow that was charged, who, by the way, was acquitted, and this was in the 1950s. Mary Fagan was a teenage girl. She was raised in Marietta. She's buried in Marietta. where I'm from. And child labor was very common at the time. The first industry was really the manual type industry and textile mills. And children were the ones that generally worked there. It was accepted in society at the time. She was owed $1.20 for past wages. Now back then we had the first rapid transit, even though Cobb has none today, but we had the first rapid transit in Cobb County. It's called the trolley line, and it was run by the Atlanta and Georgia Atlanta Power, and I can't remember the name. What's the name? Atlanta. I still run across it in title searches every once in a while. Atlanta Northern Line. That's what it was. Anyway, so there was a line, a streetcar that ran every hour going to Atlanta, and another one that was returning to Atlanta. She rode the streetcar down to Atlanta because the plant was closed because we were having Memorial Day. Not Yankee Memorial Day as they called it at the time, Confederate Memorial Day, April 26th. And so she knew the plant was closed, but she also knew that Mr. Frank worked there, and she wanted to get her $1.20 because her family needed it. So the plant was closed, and she went, and there's no question she went there, no question she saw Leo Frank, in my view, but her body was found the next morning in the basement where the incinerator was. Now this is going to become important a little bit later. There was two ways to get downstairs. One was with an elevator, but it was a very rudimentary elevator. It didn't have any brakes on it. It stopped when it hit the ground, and you would jump and ran. It didn't have a brake. It just went up a couple of floors. And then there was a ladder that went into the basement. Mary Fagan was found in the basement, and there was soot on her face. Her dress was hiked up, and she was found early the next morning by a fellow named Newt Lee, who worked there. He was a janitor, or worked around the plant. And of course, Frank and police were called and all of that. And Newt Lee was the first suspect. Now remember, this was before the time of Miranda. It was before the time of anything that had any essence of being a due process, particularly if you were an African American in the South. And in fact, both as to Newt Lee and to Conley, Jim Conley, who we'll talk about in just a moment, that became the star witness, the newspaper said, would have stories that I've read, Conley, Lee being sweated by the police. Now we can only imagine what was being sweated was, but it was not uncommon, even when I started practicing law, I hate to say this, for police officers to get carried away with rubber hoses and everything else. The police pretty well ruled Newt Lee out. And then the focus turned on Jim Conley. Now Conley was a janitor or a gopher or whatever in the office. He gave 3 different statements, 3 different affidavits, which all changed through time. He became the star witness. And what he said was that Frank wanted to have sex with Mary, and that he had taken her into the lathe room. His office was on the same floor as the manufacturing, and a wood lathe was there, and that he had hit her too hard. This was his final story. and that he called Conley up to take her down to the elevator because she was dead. Now, this is going to become critical later. Conley also said that they had mattress tick, which is that striped cloth that was around mattress, and they wrapped her in to take her down there. And Conley also said that he and Frank together took her down the elevator, you know, the one that, and this became critical later, particularly to Governor Slayton. Frank was indicted based on that testimony and put on trial pretty well. The trial took about a month. He was represented by, Frank was represented by what probably was the best lawyer in Georgia at the time. His name was Luther Rosser. The prosecution was represented by, up to that time, a lackluster prosecutor by the name of Hugh Dorsey. By the way, just as a footnote, Hugh Dorsey and his wife's daughter would later marry Luther Rosser's son. So everything is connected. You know, there's only 7 degrees of separation. Judge Roan was the judge and was considered a very good judge, and was. Now, the difference in the trials were greatly different than they are today. The Fulton County Courthouse was on Marietta Street at the time. There was no air conditioning, as you might imagine, so the windows were open during the day. And this is one of the things that Oliver Wendell Holmes and Charles Evan Hughes wrote about in dissents in the case was the mob outside. And somebody would sit in the window, so it's reported in the case, and holler out what the testimony was. And there would be a roar of approval or a boo of disapproval. There are some that say, and I've read some of these reports, the jury was sequestered and was kept at the old Kimball House. And I have read some reports of, as the jury would come up from the Kimball House to go to the courthouse every day, that parts of the mob would say, hang the Jew or we'll hang you. Whatever it was, there, and I don't think there's a lot of dispute about this, there was a mob presence there. The effect they had is open to dispute. Well, to make a long story short, because I only have a little time and I want to get to John Slayton and the lynching. Make a long story short, Frank was convicted and sentenced to hang. Georgia let every sheriff hang his own folks at the time. And Fulton County had what was called the Tower, that he was to be hung there. The case went to the Supreme Court of the United States twice. There were 2 dissents, Charles Evan Hughes and Oliver Wendell Holmes. And Hughes wrote, and I won't get into it I read it last night again, about the influence of the mob. John Slayton was governor of Georgia. He was called Jack. He was a rising star in Georgia politics. And everybody said that he was going to be the next United States Senator. And he was married to the wealthiest woman in Georgia. Her name was Grant, Sarah Frances Grant. She was called Sally. In fact, John Slayton is buried in the Grant Mausoleum at Oakland Cemetery. Not his own. He was buried in his wife's mausoleum. The case finally came up to him in June of 2015. Now, he had been watching the case, and he had started his own investigation in the case. We had crazy times of governors taking office back then. He was going out of office, and Governor Nat Harris was coming in. Nat Harris was the governor who signed a bill allowing women to practice law in Georgia. And Nat Harris was the governor coming in, and I'm sure, like every other governor, he'd say, maybe it won't get there before I leave. But he had been governor twice. We didn't have a lieutenant governor then. He'd been president of the Senate in 1911 when Hoke Smith died, and he became acting governor for about 18 months. And then Joseph Mackey Brown, the son of Joseph E. Brown, the Civil War governor, served one term in between. And then Slayton came back and served the second term, is when he caught the Leo Frank case. He read the entire month-long transcript. He did his own investigation. He took detectives and Hugh Dorsey to the scene, and he came to the conclusion that there was not certainty as to the death penalty. Now, he middled around on whether he was actually guilty. He said there was not certainty. He wrote, and I'll leave it here in Kathy if anybody wants to see it, they can. He wrote a commutation order, 29 pages, where he set out the evidence in detail. He talked about all of the witnesses and things that had arisen since that time. One of the things that he depended on was, remember, Conley said that he and Frank had taken Mary Fagan down the elevator, and so the police, when they came down there, and remember that elevator hit the bottom. The police reports coming the next morning to investigate said that they found, no, this is indelicate, human excrement when someone had a bowel movement under the elevator. Well, now, that is when they came to investigate. And that was a turning point, as you'll see with him, one of the turning points. Because he said that if they had gone down on the elevator, it would have smushed the excrement and there would have been a smell. And in fact, it was not until the next day that it occurred. Another thing that he relied upon was this. Judge Roan, who had presided over the trial, had talked with Slayton and had written him a letter in which Judge Roan said, I have doubt. I have doubt. And if I had the power, he didn't think he had the power at the time. He was wrong, and Governor Slayton tells him, yeah, he could have done it. I probably would have granted a new trial. There's a lot of litigation that's going on right now for our Georgia Supreme Court on the power of his trial judge sitting as a 13th juror. That is, the right to set aside and put their own judgment in. And so, based upon that and the other facts, there was some hair on the lathe, and somebody testified. Remember, we didn't have scientific things like we do now. Well, it looks like Mary Fagan's hair. After the trial, there was somebody that found a microscope and looked at it, and a doctor gave an opinion. This is not the same hair. That can't happen after the trial. At the trial, there had been women, both that had been brought up. Well, Frank tried to sexually harass me in this age, and another group that says, "Oh, I've worked with him for years," and had no problem whatsoever. Well, and in fact, Slayton received over 100,000 letters. He talks about it in his commutation order. He decided he was going to commute the sentence. And he wrote this order. He went home and told his wife, Sally, and she said, and he said, I don't know what's going to happen here to us. And she said, I would rather be the widow of a brave man than the wife of a coward. And he signed the commutation. Let me read to you part of it. The performance of my duty under the Constitution is a matter of my conscience. The responsibility rests where the power is reposed. Judge Roan, with that awful sense of responsibility, which probably came over him as he thought of that judge before he would shortly appear. Judge Roan had died in the interim. Calls to me from another world to request that I do that which he should have done. I can endure misconstruction, abuse, and condemnation, but I cannot stand the constant companionship of an accusing conscience, which will remind me in every thought that I, as governor of Georgia, failed to do what I thought to be right. There is a territory between a reasonable doubt and an absolute certainty, for which the law provides in allowing life imprisonment instead of execution. This case has been marked by such doubt. He was interviewed a little bit later after that, and he wrote, and this is what he said. 2,000 years ago, another governor washed his hands and turned over a Jew to a mob. For 2,000 years, that governor's name has been cursed. If today another Jew, Leo Frank, were lying in his grave because I had failed to do my duty, I would all through life find his blood on my hands and would consider myself an assassin through cowardice. Well, now he went out of office within 4 or 5 days, Slayton did. What was the reaction? Well, he had to have the state militia escort him to the train station to leave. He slipped back in from time to time, but he stayed gone 10 years before he came back to start back practicing law. He went on, he was successful. He went on and was one of the, before our unified bar, he was president of the state bar. But he never, of course, held political office again. Now, what happened to Leo Frank? Well, Leo Frank was in the tower, the Fulton Tower, ready to be hung by the sheriff. And so Governor Slayton, before he released the commutation, had the sheriff to take him to the state prison, which was not at Reedsville at the time. It was in Milledgeville, because Milledgeville had been the capital of Georgia until 1868 when it was moved to Atlanta. He was not there for long until his neck was slit. He had a big gash in it by an attempt on his life. And then, remember, the commutation was on June 21st, 1915. By the way, Frank was scheduled to be hung the next morning. So I mean, it was not, it was right upon him. Slayton put it off as long as he could. Well, on August the 17th, 1915, a group from Marietta got into the state prison at Milledgeville, brought Frank to Fry's Gin Road, which is right off 75 and Roswell Road in Marietta, and hung him. Now, this was not First, one of the great stain on all of us in the South is that it's estimated there were more than 4,000 African Americans lynched after the Civil War into the 1960s. Last one in Georgia was late 1940s down at Morris Bridge, Walton County. But this was the first case of a Jew being lynched. But remember, this was a tough time in Georgia. The Ku Klux was not risen yet, but it soon did after this with some of the same folks that were lynchers. And they hated three folks: Jews, blacks, Catholics. And in fact, that's one of the reasons, even as a kid, I can remember, prejudice against Catholics. There's a great story that says Richard Russell, who was a great United States Senator from Georgia, and his daddy was Chief Justice of the Georgia Supreme Court. There's a story that Dick Russell fell in love with a Catholic girl and was going to marry her. And he went to his daddy and told him that he was going to marry her. And he said, well, son, he said, you can marry her, but your days of politics are over in Georgia. And he never married. It's a whole nother story, because there's a provision in his will that says he wants a gift to go to a certain person that his executor knows well, things like that. But these were the leaders of the community. There's a famous photograph of the lynching with Frank hanging there. And to the right is the Superior Court judge standing there. His name was Newt Morris. This is who they think, let me tell you about if you get interested in this case will drive you crazy. But if you get interested, the book you should read is The Dead Shall Rise by Steve Oney. Steve Oney came to see us in the 80s. I was always enthralled with the case. And Tom Watson, one of the things I hadn't mentioned, Tom Watson, who was one of the great political leaders and Hugh Dorsey went on to become governor from this. Tom Watson went on to become United States Senator. Tom Watson had a newspaper called the Jeffersonian, and he printed headlines in red. And it was scandalous, the reporting on the trial that occurred every day. Jew pervert, he used words like that in the headlines instead of being factual. Here's some of the ones that were involved. Steve Oney has devised it up. Joseph M. Brown. Well, he was governor from 1909 to 1911, 1912 to 13. Right before Jack Slayton. He was from Marietta. Charlie Brown, his grandson, just died last year. These folks are still around. Newton Augustus Morris. He was the Superior Court judge. And his great-nephew, Andy, is on the city council of Marietta. I once said, you can't be an old Marietan unless you had an ancestor that was at the lynching of Leo Frank. And it's just about the truth. Eugene Herbert Clay. He was the son of the United States Senator. He was mayor of Marietta. But at the time that this occurred, he was what we called him then, the Solicitor General, the district attorney today. I always loved the old name Solicitor General. I wish they hadn't changed it. They still call them solicitors. He is the one that presided and called the grand jury in to listen to evidence about who had taken Leo Frank and lynched him. Surprise, surprise, the grand jury returned a finding that it was persons unknown in the community. John Tucker Dorsey. His son later, Jasper Dorsey, would be president of Bell South, or Southern Bell as we called it back then. John Tucker Dorsey, he was one of the best trial lawyers there was. He was a member of the General Assembly. He was on the he was chairman of the prison committee. It's probably how they got in so easily down in Milledgeville. He served as district attorney for 2 years, John Tucker did. He had been twice convicted of manslaughter. I mean, folks were a little bit different back then, you know, and had served an imprisonment on the chain gang, and then was later pardoned by the governor so he could go to law school and become district attorney. He was a distant cousin of Hugh Dorsey, who was the prosecutor. Fred Morris, he was a Marietta lawyer, serving his first term in the General Assembly. He organized the Boy Scouts in Marietta, and then went off to the lynching of Leo Frank. Boland Glover Brumby, like I say, it had every prominent family in Marietta. He owned the Marietta Chair Company, you know, the Brumby Rocker. This is where it comes from. He was Oni describes Brumby as the very image of an arrogant Southern aristocrat, and that nothing angered him more than Yankees. The field commanders, those were kind of the planners. The field commanders was a fellow named George Daniel. He ran a jewelry shop on the Marietta Square and was one of the founding members of the Rotary Club. These folks were not riffraff. Gordon Baxter Gann, he was from Mableton, by the way, but he was ordinary and was a former mayor of Marietta. Newt Mays Morris, they called him Black Newt. Now, Black Newt would whip you. He ran the chain gang in Cobb County, and they called him Whipping Newt or Black Newt. William J. Fry, he had been the sheriff of Cobb County from 1903 to 1909. He prepared the noose used to hang Frank, and may have actually looped it around Frank's neck. Fry's Gin Road, was the location of where they hung him, was his property. E.P. Dick Dobbs, he later became very prominent. His family moved north, and he was the mayor of Marietta at the time. L.B. Robertson was a railroad freight agent. He lent his car to the lynch party. Jim Brumby, Boland Glover Brumby's brother, he owned a garage and serviced the automobiles before they went. It was a big affair to go from Marietta to Milledgeville at the time. Robert A. Hill was a banker. He helped fund the lynching, got to make sure they had enough money for gas and other things. George Swanson, who was the current sheriff of Cobb County in 1915, and two of his deputies, William McKinney and George Hicks. Cicero Holton Dobbs, he was a taxi driver and operated a grocery store. He was also my wife's grandfather, who knew nothing about this before Steve Oney wrote the book and was very upset about it all. This case had been whispered about for years and years and years. And even among the Jewish community. Steve Seelig told me, he says, we never mentioned the case. Never mentioned it in the Jewish community. D.R. Benton was a farmer and an uncle of Mary Fagan's. Horace Hamby was a farmer. Coon Shaw, that's J.F. Saw's, who died about 5 years ago, father, he was a mule trader. Emmett and Luther Burton we had an Emmett Burton served, which was this was the great uncle and grandfather of Emmett Burton, who was on our county commission for several years. There were two brothers who are believed to have sat on either side of Leo Frank in the automobile that took him from prison to death. Emmett is said to have been a police officer and Luther a coal yard operator. Yellow Jacket Brown, you know, everybody had a nickname, an electrician who rode his motorcycle to Milledgeville and cut the telephone lines before they got there so that nobody could call out. And Lawrence Haney, a farmer. What has amazed me about this case was, how could the best folks in town, the best and the leading citizens of the county and of the city, how could they have gone crazy? I ask myself that in our national politics every once in a while now. How could everybody have gone crazy? What happened to Rudy Giuliani? I don't know. I mean, you know, we could always have a discussion of that to bring it to. But what was it? Now, I know that there's two or three things on the other side that everybody tries to bring up. One is, well, they just felt that they were carrying out the lawful sentence that was handed down to Leo Frank. That's what Newt Morris is reported to have said later. And then the other thing is Luther Rosser and Jack Slayton had practiced law before, and that Luther Rosser paid Jack Slayton off to commute the sentence. Now let me tell you something. Jack Slayton had the wealthiest wife in Georgia. And at that time, husbands, as you well know from studying law, managed the affairs of the wife. Why in the world, to destroy his political career, which was very bright, would he have taken any money? And you cannot read this commutation order without seeing that it is a man that was greatly troubled by it. So the last thing I'll talk about a little bit was Leo Frank guilty? I don't think there's any doubt, and there are a few that I think that argue with this today, is he did not get a fair trial. Not under the circumstances that we would consider today. Coerced statements, no scientific, all circumstantial. The testimony of an accomplice, you know, the law, there is a reason that the common law and the law of Georgia says that the testimony of an accomplice must be corroborated. And a confession must be corroborated. And the reason is because of how both of them might have been obtained. I don't think he was guilty. I think Conley killed. I don't think, there's not any doubt in my mind that Conley killed. But there's at least there is substantial, reasonable doubt as to whether Frank killed him. There's two little things, and then I'll try to answer some questions. I know we got started late, and I know y'all got other places to go. There's two things that are happening. One is the district attorney, Paul Howard in Fulton County, has created a commission to look into several cases. One of them is this case, and another one is the child murders case. And they've got about half a dozen to a dozen cases they're looking into to make sure that there's guilt. Now, Wayne Williams is still alive and in the prison. The other thing that has happened in all of these matters, and that I think is the important. What's the role of lawyers and judges? Listen, we are trained to look at facts. There is only a little thin line that separates us from lynchers and a mob, and it is lawyers and judges that are trained to not let passion and prejudice overcome us all. And it is difficult. It is very, very difficult. And it is not an easy path. It is a tough path. You know, we believe as lawyers that everybody is entitled to representation. That was our theory all along, but not our practice. Read about the Scottsboro boys. Read about through history and the cases that you study. But it is required even more now than ever that even though everybody cusses us as lawyers, and they do, you know, all the time. Mama don't let you babies grow up to be lawyers, you know, isn't the story, instead of cowboys. But it is the lawyers that have to protect the rights of the individual. And if we ever lose that we're not willing to sacrifice ourselves and our reputation and our prosperity for the rights of those that we represent or what we know is right, then I want to tell you, we're lost. We're lost. It's a very thin line. Always be the guardians against prejudice, hatred, and passion. Sit back and use the skills that you're being trained, and they will be honed much more as you start practicing, to analyze critically, everything that you're presented with. Thank you, and God bless you, and I'll be glad to answer a few questions. I know we don't have much time, but I'll be glad to answer any question you have. Yes, ma'am.
Was anyone from that long list of
Never.
prominent lynchers
Nobody was ever
prosecuted?
tried.
Never?
And what happened was, Luther Haynes, who was Superior Court judge, good friend of Hugh, Luther Haynes practiced law with John Tucker Dorsey when he was a young lawyer. And of course, I was assigned to Luther's courtroom when I was a prosecutor, and then he and I were great friends to the day he died. But he knew I was interested in the case, and he showed me one time a file that John Tucker Dorsey had in his office, and it had a list of the names of those that were involved. And that's the way Oney finally broke it. He broke it through two people, through Luther Haynes and through Bill Kenny. Now, as they began to die, you know, in the 30s, 40s, 50s, several of them confessed on deathbed about it, but nobody was ever prosecuted. You know, I will tell you a footnote about Herbert Clay. I don't know if it's true or not, but Luther told me this. He said, I said, how did Herbert Clay how did he die? He said he was holed up with a prostitute. She hit him over the head with a liquor bottle and killed him. Anybody else?
Well, to tell what we did in the 80s and what we're trying to do now and how they differ, this was addressed in the 80s back
In the
here, I
80s,
think.
when Larry and I were Governor Harris's floor leaders, he got involved in the case. And Frank was issued a posthumous pardon based on the fact he did not receive due process. what we're trying to do now, a group of us, and it's been helpful, and Dale Schwartz and several others, is to pardon him on the basis of innocence and to have an extraordinary motion neutrality. Not going to do Leo Frank any good. So people say, well, why are you digging up all this? The reason we're digging up all this is because it should be a testament and a monument that this should never happen again. It's the reason we continue to teach that Auschwitz, in fact, did exist, and that 6 million Jews were killed. And so, that's what we do this for. We right the wrongs. And hopefully we're not involved in making, even though there were several lawyers that were involved in making this wrong. And that's the reason it is so important for you to understand that difference. Thank you, and y'all go to class. I know before I